This is the third part of the Ancient Civilizations notes for Mr. O'Keefe's World History class. And today we're going to talk about ancient societies, but before we get into that, we are going to review last section's notes, which was about ancient governments. So, what is the purpose of government? To organize and protect a society, whether it's the military to protect it, or as far as organization goes, we have roads and public works and schools, public transportation. All that would be organizing a society. How does a bureaucracy work? All right, remember we took apart this word, and we took apart lots of words here in the last sections of notes. You have bureau, which is, maybe you remember, like I said, old people call dresser a bureau, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It just means it's made up in different sections. And then CRACY, like democracy and theocracy, we know that has to do with government. So how does the bureaucracy work? It uses specialized jobs and different levels of authority to accomplish tasks. Like the military is a bureaucracy. Specialized jobs, you have pilots, you have snipers, you have janitors, you have cooks, you have people who deliver the mail, you have people who are mechanics. Specialized jobs, and then of course you have different ranks: private, general, lieutenant, colonel, so on and so forth. So that's a good example of a bureaucracy. Next question: how could a country become an empire? You know, that vocabulary word empire. The answer: it would expand its borders and influence by use of force. And we talked about how the U.S. did that with Hawaii. We used force, not necessarily a straight up war, but we kind of bullied our way in and took over that land. And that's how we kind of had our start, right? Britain came in and they expanded their land into the Americas, kicking out Native Americans to form the 13 colonies. So that's another example of building an empire. Next question: who rules in a theocracy? The answer to that is a priest, because remember, we have that suffix CRACY again, so you know it has to do with government, and then the prefix theo, like theology is a study of religion, that means religion. So government run by a religion. What is the difference between a representative and direct democracy? Okay, it's not as difficult as you might think. Democracy, we know, again, we have the suffix CRACY. Government, we talked about demo. Demos is a Greek word for people, so government run by the people. So we're voting. So we're voting directly on laws, or voting directly for a representative. Okay, so direct, you're voting for a law. Representative, you're voting for someone who will vote for a law, kind of like a middleman. Because we here in the U.S., there's so many laws that are passed and different budgets that are formed, and we have committees and subcommittees in Congress. So it would be really, really difficult for all 300 million, some of us, to know what the right vote for laws would be, how it affects California or Rhode Island or Hawaii. So we basically vote people that they're in for it to be their kind of specialty to work on. Where in ancient Athens, things were a little bit more simple, so they could directly vote on laws and decisions made by the government. Next question: who rules in an oligarchy? The answer there is a small group of wealthy people. And remember, this differs from an aristocracy, where an aristocracy is an entire class of people. So it's a larger group of wealthy people. What is the difference between a monarchy and a tyranny? Well, a monarchy, the power is shifted by the family. So if your dad's the king and you're the firstborn son, usually, then you're going to be the next king. That's how you know how power is transferred, right? In the U.S., power is transferred by however the voters decide it to be transferred. Where tyranny, they just use force. We talked about Rome and Julius and Augustus Caesar, how they used force and their military to acquire power in Rome. That makes them tyrants. Okay, so how do societies run? Because we talked about how government is created to protect and organize a society. Well, what's a society? Well, we know it's a group of people, right? We live in a society, and societies are all broken up in specific ways. So we have cities expanding, we have job specialization, which we talked about earlier. The nomads had societies, right? They had a real simple one. The men had a job, the women had a different job, and that was how their societies broken down. Of course, it's more complicated today, but that's how things are. The more technology, the more innovation, the more complex our society becomes, obviously the more complex everything gets. So, and sometimes religion builds into that. Sometimes the government, the type of government builds into that. So people had a place in their society based on their job, family, or religious status. And we all have a place in society. Now, today, we have something called social mobility where we can move up or down in our society. So if you're born poor in America, there's a chance that you can die very rich, or you can die poor, or you can die middle class. You can move around. That's what mobility means. In ancient times, that was less common. In ancient times, if you were born poor, that's just how things were. You were going to be poor your whole life. You were born as a farmer. You would be born as a baby, right? Not a farmer. But if you were born into a family of farmers, your dad was a farmer, for example, guess what you were going to do? You were going to be a farmer. What if you want to be an astronaut? Doesn't matter. You're going to be a farmer. And how do you know what an astronaut is in ancient times? Anyways, so that's kind of how jobs were decided back then, is the family, right? And that's how it was for a very long time. It's a relatively new thing to just kind of pick what you want to be. So that's kind of nice for us today, but that's not how things always were. And we talk a lot today about equality. Is our society equal? Well, no, it's not, because we have different levels of our society. So we'll take a look at that right now and kind of compare our society to ancient societies. So I'm going to actually do ancient societies first. And usually they are kind of shown in a triangle. Why? Well, because the area of the triangle denotes the amount of people in that society that were in that class. So, for example, the top class, and it was different. As you'll see, every ancient society was different. India had it one way, China had it a different way, Mesopotamia had it another way. So I'm just kind of going to generalize, right? But here we have the high class people at the top. There's not a lot of them, right? And maybe this is where you'd see the aristocracy up at the top. All right, then you have maybe your middle, upper class, and you might see some, this is really sloppy. Looks like I'm a 5-year-old writing this. Sorry. You might see people who were educated here. Not everyone was educated. Most people weren't educated. Most people, like by and large, 95% of the population didn't know how to read or write. Probably more than 95% didn't know how to read or write. So if you did, you're probably up here. And how you got to learn was, well, your parents were, well, not your mom, but your dad probably was able to. All right, maybe here we have more of the kind of the middle class. Maybe you were a skilled laborer. You were a trader. Didn't know how to read or write, but you still had something that was pretty valuable to do. Now, the chunk of ancient societies where most people lived in, what they did, they were farmers. Because you needed lots of food for all these people to live, right? Well, so you need lots of farmers to farm that food. Most people, all throughout history, after nomads, were farmers. And they were poor farmers. You basically farmed and you were able to eat some of your food, but you had to sell the rest, and that was how things went. So most people in ancient societies were farmers, and there wasn't really any movement. Okay, could you move up and down? No, big red X, so everything's red. You can't move up and down. You're stuck in that class. You're not going to move. Now, if we talk about today's society in America, it's actually not going to be a triangle. It's going to be a diamond. And that is because most people in America are in the middle class. Okay, you have the upper class, you have the middle class, and you have the lower class in America. And again, most people are in the middle class. So upper class, what kind of jobs do you have? Well, you have CEOs, and you have some doctors. Not all doctors would be in the upper class, but maybe like Wall Street investors, people who are super rich, people who run insurance companies, like that. But most people are, again, middle class. Teachers, some doctors, I guess, dentists and plumbers and electricians and power line workers, and most jobs you can think of are middle class. Unless you get paid around the minimum wage, then you're going to be lower class. Low class people don't have a job, or they have a job that pays close to the minimum wage. Can you move? Yes, you absolutely can move, and if you're, well, anywhere, hopefully you move up. We're going to put a Y for yes. I don't want to draw a smiley face because it's going to look really sad, and that's kind of defeating the point of the smiley face. So you can move up. That's called, remember, social mobility. It's society. Mobility means you can move. You can move. Check. Over here, social mobility. I'll put another X because you can't usually move up and down. Now there's another level to ancient societies that I didn't really put in there, but we'll add it in at the bottom, and that is slaves. A lot of slaves in ancient times. Slaves came from, really, if there's an expansion of your empire, you would maybe take those people from that area and make them slaves, and you could sell them and make lots of money. They could live in your city and you could make them work. So slaves aren't something that just America had. Slaves are something that's really been all through history before we had slaves in this country. So that's part of society too. We can't ignore that those people were there. And you'll learn more about how slaves are treated in different places, but you can guess pretty horribly everywhere. And thank God we don't have slaves in America anymore. But there's a nice comparison between the two, between some ancient societies and in our society today. Now we're going to look in particular at Indian society, ancient Indian society, because it's maybe the most unique and the most interesting. So instead of classes in this caste system, we're going to call it a caste, which I guess makes sense, right? Not classes, castes. Why? Because classes you move from, right? You're in my class, you're going to move to a different class, and then you're going to move to a different class. And you probably came from another class. So classes you can move around with. And castes, I know it's spelled different, but this is just to help you remember it. If you break your arm, you get it in a cast because you don't want the arm to move, right? It's supposed to keep it from moving. So caste system, there's no social mobility. So as you can see, it's a social hierarchy, which just means there's different levels, kind of like a bureaucracy, based on family and occupation. So based on who your father is and what job that they do, and whatever that is going to be what you're going to do, right? So if your father is a priest, that's good. You're at the top. You're going to be a priest. Don't want to be a priest? Doesn't matter. That's what you're going to do. And then we see kshatriyas, warriors and rulers. And as we kind of go down, we get to the untouchables. Now, the untouchables really were almost seen as not humans, and they're treated pretty poorly. Why? Well, because they believed in reincarnation, they being Indians, not just the untouchables. So it was believed that you could move up in the caste system, but not in your lifetime. And it's a religious thing, right? So the belief and we'll talk about this when we get into ancient religions in more detail. But in Hinduism, this is the religion here. In Hinduism, society is very closely tied to the religion. So we're going to talk about it in kind of both places here. In Hinduism, you have two main elements. You have karma and you have dharma. You've heard of karma before, maybe not dharma. So karma is all the good things you do in your life. Then by good, I mean you have to follow your caste. That's kind of what was seen as good. Dharma is like your duties. So the jobs that you have. So you have to do the job in your caste. So if you're a Sudra, you're going to be someone who builds huts or builds streets. Not really take that much skill. I'm sure it does today, but back then, not so much. Where if you're a Vaisya, you would have more. Maybe you'd be an artisan and you make, cool jewelry or something like that, where it's a little bit more valuable. So that's the job you have to do in your caste. You have to stay in your caste. What if you are a Kshatriya and you fall in love with some girl or boy that's a Vaisya? Don't get married unless you want to have everyone hate you, I guess, and also be reincarnated to a lower caste. You want to move up. It's this reincarnation. We've heard of this before. You die, your body's gone, and your soul reincarnates. It goes into a different body. And the hope is, let's say you're untouchable, their job was really just to clean excrement. And that's a fancy word for poop. So it was a crappy job. Get it? I'm sure you do. Why did they do that job? Why wouldn't they just run away? Well, because that's part of their dharma. They had to do it. That was their duty. That's another kind of a joke, the duty part, because they had to clean up poop. Yeah. So if they believe that if they did their job and they did it well, when they died, their life's going to suck. They knew that. But when they die, they're hoping that they would reincarnate into a higher level. They would be a Sudra, where it's not so bad. And then if they live their life there, they'd go up. Now, why do people think that the untouchables here are unhuman or like really bad, and they would, even today in some rural areas in India, these people are abused and beaten and all kinds of things, murdered? Why? Well, because they don't have a hell in Hinduism, right? In Christianity and Islam, there's a hell. Bad people go there. Well, where do bad people go, or bad souls go in the caste system? Well, they go to the untouchables. So that's kind of seen as like, well, what if you thought that one of those people were Hitler or something like that, a really bad person, or a rapist or some, a murderer? Well, they die and their soul goes down there. So why would you treat them nicely? Is maybe the idea behind that. Which kind of sounds rough if you don't believe in Hinduism, but if you did, maybe that makes sense to you. And that's kind of belief is that's their punishment. And no one, if they're treated well, and people think, well, if I'm a bad guy and then my soul's reincarnated into lower caste, but that's not that bad to do that, then why do I have to be good? That's kind of the idea behind that. Is, well, we have to treat them poorly so that people aren't bad. And I know there's some problems with that, but I'm just kind of trying to show you both sides of why that's the case. I think that's all I got to tell you about the caste system. But remember, there's no social mobility in your lifetime. However, when you are reincarnated, that can be on the table for you. And we'll talk more about that when we get to ancient religions. And then the last society we're going to talk about is Rome. So Rome was divided into two main parts that we'll talk about. Technically, there was more than two, but we're just going to go with the basics here. So the top, we have the patricians. Okay, they are rich. They are in the upper class. They're born into it. They could vote because remember it's a republic, so they're voting on their for the representatives, and they could be elected into office. So they could run. They could vote for themselves. That's a patrician. Okay, this is probably silly, but if your name is Patricia and you're kind of like a don't take this the wrong way, but if you're like a hillbilly, you're just kind of, no one calls you Patricia, they call you Patty, right? But if you're a rich, sophisticated woman, wears high heels every day, no one calls you Patty, they call you Patricia. And that's kind of maybe a silly but hopefully effective way to remember the patricians are at the top. because underneath them you have the plebeians. And the plebeians, don't think of them really as poor, but they're not educated. Um, but they were still Roman citizens. They could vote, but not be elected into office. So back then, if you were a farmer, your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your dad made sandals, then you made sandals, and that's all you really knew. You knew how to farm. You learned how to make sandals or whatever you did, make hats. That's your knowledge. You didn't learn about geometry or biology. You just knew how to make hats or shoes or crops. And that was it. And maybe that, well, not maybe, but that is really why plebeians couldn't be elected into office. Okay, what would they say? Like, hey, elect me and I'll just teach everyone how to make hats, and it's not very helpful. Whereas patricians, they didn't really have a job. They just were born into money, and they just kind of hung out and enjoyed their awesome life. But they also were educated, though. So they did learn about biology and about math and all that kind of stuff, and also about how to run a country. So it would make more sense. You'd want someone who was educated to run your country. Hopefully, that was kind of the idea there. And if you think back to the caste system, a big reason studying these ancient societies is important is because it shows you what they value, what each society really actually valued. So if you think about our society, what do we value? Money, right? Well, isn't there a reason then that the rich people are at the top and the poor people are at the bottom? Is that fair? Doesn't really feel good to say that, right? Well, you're poor, you're at the bottom. It's like, well, what year is it? But that's how our society is set up, right? We respect in our culture, which is linked to our society, we respect rich people, right? Kim Kardashian, people respect her. Why? I don't know. I guess because she's got money, right? Maybe someone who actually respects her could explain why they respect her. But I haven't really met anyone, which I don't know. I feel good about saying that. Maybe there's other reasons. But we listen to what rich people have to say, even though they might not know what they're talking about. We still listen to them, and that's because we respect money, right? We all want a job that pays a lot. No one grows up and says, I want to work at, I want to be a greeter at Walmart. You can't do that till you're like 90 anyways, but maybe you do. But you get my point. Everyone wants a job that makes a lot of money, except for me and your other teachers. But for the most part, it's because we respect that, right? Well, who's at the top in the caste system? The priests. That means they value what? Religion, right? They value religion, they value protection, and they don't really value people who break the religion, the people at the bottom who are down there as punishments. Right? What about the Romans? What do they value? Well, they value wealth, they value knowledge, and we can tell. We talked in the first section about how Rome had running water. We're talking a long, long time ago. It's not very common. There's still places today that don't have running water, but Rome did. They had fountains, they had toilets, which that's kind of important, I think. They had these huge public baths. Some of the baths were heated baths, like big hot tubs. Some of them were cooled. That's really impressive. They have roads that are still around today that they built, and walls, and of course the Colosseum. So none of that's possible without education. So it shows that Romans valued education. Of course, unfortunately, it wasn't available for everybody, but that's kind of how things were back then. You didn't have big combines to harvest the crops. They had to be done by hand, so that's a lot less time that you have. If you're a farmer, you just have to farm the whole time. You have time to go to school and learn about trigonometry. All right, so I do want to go over a couple group things. You're going to work in a group in this next assignment. So just so you know, bigger groups, make sure you contribute. I expect everyone to contribute. Stay on task. I expect that too. Talk to group members and only them. If you're talking to a different group, you're distracting your group and you're distracting that group. If you're in groups of 4, that's 8 people. That's like a third of the class that you're distracting. So please don't do that. If you want to talk to group members. And that's going to be it for today. We'll go over the directions more specifically about everything But thank you for tuning in.